story marker, I accidentally ended up writing about 40 pages instead of, 3 pages for the article. And they said, actually, Mark, we're going to split this into two. And today's talk is about, as you can see that on the screen, placemaking, the idea of designing places and making them accessible, and then the system of support for a child out there trying to get into nature. And the three people at the bottom have just been a huge influence. Louise Charla, I'm sure you folk are all familiar with Louise. She happens to be here at CU, and she's been so helpful. I work with her a lot now, and she just provides me with all the information in terms of the science side of sensory inputs, etc. Adam Bienenstock, he's a champion in Canada for the natural play movement. And then Michelle Mathis works a lot with like Montessori schools, etc., on the smaller, fine skills, outdoor access to nature. And then just because I've gone through the tough part here, here is Lydia. And I just want to point out, once you understand your child with disability, who she is and where she's coming from, and you learn an amazing personality, you'll see on the right, last year we got her a talker. And she still hasn't fully learned to use that, but a few things are starting to come out. On the left, you see that smile. You see Gromit, her assistant's dog. He'll pop up a little bit. And in the middle, I want to tell you that she absolutely adores lollipops. Even though she's on a G-tube, that is her special treat, especially blue ones. So what I've learned over the years with Lydia, and that was the point I was really trying to make today, is that I try to be Lydia's voice as best I can. I know I don't represent it perfectly, but it's not about medical fragility or being risk averse. To me, it's universally disability is wild and out there, and it's full of novel mutations. And I like the last part because that was ultimately Lydia's non-diagnosis, was she had a novel mutation, which actually led us to have our third child, Momi, when we discovered that. So diving into this idea of getting outdoors into play, there's like three to four sections here in the talk today, or the discussion. And the first one is just recognizing I've spent many years, frankly, since 2008, I've actually met Richard Louv in Oregon when I was working there for state parks. And it was trying to discover how we move away from prefabricated play and a lack of access, sort of regulated play, even in the wilderness, to nature play. And we discovered it's old play. So I'd just like to pause a moment, because this isn't like an exercise we do when we're building or working with kids on natural play areas across what I used to do it in Oregon, now do it obviously in Boulder, Colorado, is we start with this exercise. And it's a simple question. What is one of your favorite childhood memories in nature? And think about the activity, the associated emotions, or the sensory inputs. So if anyone would like, and Marissa, sorry, if you could help with this, just if anyone has thoughts, try and remember that first childhood memory outside, and just jot them in the chat box. And feel free to call them out, Marissa, as they come up.
Sounds great.
Sorry, yeah, I can't see the chat box, so if you want to call them out.
No. I think people are thinking about it.
Okay.
I enjoyed when my family and I went to Sequoia National Park when I was younger. Aaron is sharing collecting pet worms from the garden. Dr. Escamilla is saying chasing dragonflies in Mexico. Tiffany is sharing, I recall playing near a lake. Hannah looking for ladybugs in my neighborhood park. Mirka going camping and seeing the stars. Other students are sharing making mud pies, finding secret nooks inside bushes to make caves, walking through with my friends, playing with dirt and making mud, going to the beach, the park, the play structure, sand, etc. Going to the beach and building sandcastles in San Diego, picking bluebonnets in Texas off the side of the freeway, playing house, making, quote, pies out of dirt and acorns. My dad used to take me on hikes as a young child, and there was a moment when we saw a herd of deer, and we both just stopped and were mesmerized for a moment. It was very spiritual and beautiful. Uninterrupted time building forts with my parents nowhere to be seen. Cotton fields. My grandparents had a house on a lake, and I used to play in the lake and fish with my grandfather.
Wow,
Um, and there's more coming in. So, Mark,
I
do you
know.
want to keep reading or?
I probably should keep moving along, but
Okay, that sounds great. But I love everyone's participation. So,
I do
thank
really appreciate it, and it's interesting there because there's a couple of observations, and this is a pattern that pops up. There's no parents around, and it isn't gross motor. You're not talking about a prefabricated playground that's got a bunch of swings and a little castle on it with a slide. But there was a lot of fine motor skills, pet worms and mud pies. There was collaboration, playing house, etc. And then there was some of the quiet stuff, like hiding in a cave and things like this, looking up at the stars. See, this is the point of like thinking about blowing up this idea of play and bringing it back. Because at the moment, if you took a kid to a park, none of these experiences would occur. And unfortunately, a parent at the moment will only let their child within out of range. The statistic is about 150 foot. 20 years ago, it was 3 miles. 40 years ago, it was 7 miles. So it's really hard for children to play. And then if you think about that, the problem then gets even more slightly awkward if you would take all your memories and imagine if, for instance, you could only see shadows. Imagine you were using a walker. Imagine you've had some trauma you were dealing with. How would that play activity occur? And this is really what Lydia's been teaching me to think about this more and try and come up with ways to solve this sort of conundrum. And I'll sort of finish on this section with this idea of Peter Bruegel is a Flemish painter from 1560, and I always think this is fascinating. It's 260 children playing 90 games. You'll see in the top left, there's quiet contemplative. In the bottom right, there's a little bit of gross. In the middle, there's sort of to the left, there's some fine motor skills. So you're starting to see all the different types of play that are occurring there. Compare that to a playground or going along confined to a trail in nature nowadays because you can't go off the trail in the wilderness, and how we've sort of confined our children and made it hard to play and even harder for children experiencing disability. So we're here, playground, and I actually made a declaration because I'm lucky enough to do that as the planning manager for Boulder for Parks, is that we will no longer do prefabricated play. It's not working, and it only provides a 20-minute experience, and from an accessible perspective, it doesn't work. Whereas nature play, free play, even sometimes nature themed, you'll get up to 1 hour 20, and you'll have a much richer sense of play. And instead of the 20A type kids doing 20 minutes on the playground prefab, you'll have, for instance, 100 kids doing all different types of play, up to an hour and a half statistically. So in the disability community, I'll focus in now. It is awkward. A little story here is, this is a playground in Boulder, very typical. And I once took out Lydia and Momi, it was like a Saturday. Lydia was 10, Momi was 5. And basically, it's very similar. It's not the same playground because I don't want to identify it, but I ran around on a playground on the concrete path around the edge with Lydia in the wheelchair and span around. She loves to be wiggled. Meanwhile, Moby was on the swing. Moby started to cry because she's 5. I got stuck in the wood chips. Lydia then did a thing where she just has a big seizure and a massive poop, and it was coming out of her diaper. And so I don't like to leave Lydia because she's crying, but eventually I did. And I got Moby to help me while she was crying, drag the wheelchair back out. And I opened up the trunk of the car because Lydia was about 40 pounds at the time and I could still carry her to change her diaper. And of course, it went everywhere. So I picked her up to try and move the sheet under. And at that point, she started to pee down my leg. And 2 parents walked past with their children, and you could just see the sort of look of horror, shock, not wanting to support you. And it was just a sense of shame. And the 3 of us drove home crying. And you know what would have solved that? A 60-pound changing table in the bathrooms. If only we had adult changing tables, none of that shame would have occurred. And that's one of the biggest reasons why parents won't go outdoors when their child is medically complicated. That sense of shame, which pops up in lots of different places. And that was just one example. But you'll see here on the left, another example of our current this is actually in the Federal National Guidebook for ADA Accessible Play Surfaces. The bottom left picture is you'll put down a surface instead of wood chip that allows you to get a wheelchair across, but it's almost painful because you can see how would that child get up the steps? So you're almost providing this enticement without the ability to enjoy it. On the left is what's called an accessible swing. If Lydia's in that, it's 2 foot backwards and forwards. She doesn't get any jiggles, any movement. She's getting the smell of off-gassing from the pour in place, and there's no view, especially with a bit of peripheral vision. So I just want to point out on the left here, you're starting to see the smell of grasses. Sorry, on the right, the smell of grasses. The idea of her being able to see things for a peripheral vision. She can jiggle around here and get a true sort of gross motor experience. And this was when I realized we really need to change our approach. So here's just a list, and I'll happily share a PDF afterwards of this with Marissa to share out with folks. But I think something in society as well we sort of need to change is you'll see the bottom one. I've often had parents complain to me, I'll be angry with me because I'm not doing anything for Lydia's seizure. And 100 a day, you've just got to wait it out. And I know how long it'll take, 2-3 minutes. And it would be nice to see inquiry. So why is that fear or taboo still there in society where people think it's okay to come up and shout at you about your child? And it's another reason why parents won't go outdoors into nature. We're kind of stuck inside a little bit because of fear, to be honest. And I hear this from lots of parents. So this is just sort of summarizing what I've been talking about and some of the difficulties we deal with. And I often talk about disability still being one of the taboo subjects. There's a fear out there that prevents us as a society making it a universally accessible community for families with children experiencing disability. So maybe in the movie, that was sort of the the sad part of the movie. Hopefully we'll get to the good part now. I just want to talk about some things that have emerged that I've found really helpful to actually overcome these barriers. So one thing we've done in Boulder is we've hired community connectors. These are people in the community of the community, and it started with racial equity, hiring people to work with their local community to provide feedback on what we should be doing as a government to provide better services. Who you're seeing here is Sarah, who was our first disability equity community connector, and she gets paid a living wage, works about 10 hours a week for us. And for instance, she was the first one to point out we needed sensory zones for our engagement meetings, quiet spaces to hang out. We've also started to create safe routes, not just to schools, but to parks, because being outdoors is just as important as being in a classroom. So the safe routes to parks was the first one we've actually created, and we're trying to create a few more of those. And then another thing I've noticed with programming that's really key is that on the right, I work with my colleague Topher Downham, and we can do wheelchair demonstration hikes, which are purely focused on the disability community. It's kind of a segregated thing. It allows people to get confidence to go into nature. But if you do too many disability-focused programs, you end up with exclusivity, don't you? And so we also then on the left try to balance that with other programs for all families. And you'll just see us there on top of Flagstaff Mountain and all the mobility devices. I'll talk about that in a moment, but all the different families coming together. So there is that sense of community. So you kind of needed focused programming and integrated program, I've learned over the years, a really good balance. There's also some really good nonprofits emerging in the Denver, Boulder area to support children with disability. On the left is Lockwood Foundation. That's Jeremy, who runs this, and he gets all the CU students, a bunch of volunteers, and you'll see the device on the top left there, and it can be children to adults, and he can get them up to 14,000 feet peaks. And it's simply, again, building community, tapping into students who want to do good. Jeremy having sort of that idea of why can't anyone get to the mountain peak? Meanwhile, on the right is Jenna. She runs Traveling Gnomes, or started it, I should say. And that is simply this idea of getting children with disabilities out into nature, a bit less drama than Jeremy's, let's say. It's like going around the mountain. But a key part of that to think about is in a school, you will all be aware there's a para, like Lydia has a para at school when we can get one if the wages afford it. But why can't we have pairers for nature? And that's something I've been thinking about a lot. We have lifeguards. Our department has 150 lifeguards for pools. Why can't we have 150 pairers for kids with disability to support parents because of the needs when you're out there? You need someone in front of the wheelchair to pull it along while you're pushing. And then here's something that's really exciting in the disability world is adaptive devices are mushrooming. We're seeing an amazing growth in different types of devices. The bottom left one, the adaptive Axum stroller, you'll see some pictures later. I have that one for Lydia. I actually developed my own version of the one at the top that gets you into backcountry. And then you see that picture. I mentioned Topher earlier. He's on the left of that picture. We've basically bought a bunch of devices for Boulder that any parent can call up and we'll demonstrate how to use them. We'll take them out into nature. And if they get the confidence to do it, they can do it themselves. And then eventually, if they get the money, they can buy them. And you can see how expensive they are. Unfortunately, there's a big markup in disability world. So this is the idea of buying the equipment ourselves so parents can use it. And then the one thing I'd point out, though, on the bottom there, you see that's the bottom left device is the one I made myself, and I actually had to throw it out because it was too unstable, and I nearly threw Lydia off a trail. But you've got to experiment with these things, the dignity of risk. On the right, you see Lydia skiing. What I want to point out, though, is you see the more traditional wheelchairs at the top. With a good resin-bound trail, you can really create a fantastic experience. And the reason I say that is like an ADA accessible trail will be 10-foot wide concrete. It's incredibly boring. There's no views. You're not getting any sensory inputs from brushing the trees or the grass. And like Lydia can't control a temperature. Topher actually also can't control his temperature. It's very common in the disability community. Concrete paths are incredibly hot. So you're also providing more shade and a cooler temperature to make things more welcoming. And then the final thing I'll point out in program is about 4 years ago, Topher and I created the roll and stroll, which is where the kinship comes from. My wife and I have a little joke. We get out every 2 weeks for about 90 minutes, and we can normally get about 2 pints. And we drink the 2 pints, and we used to argue about things and how to deal with stuff. And we realized the first pint could be war pint. So we argue for that first pint. And the second pint is peace pint. We talk about positive things and how we can help Lydia and what we can do with our lives that's better. So the roll and stroll also has an out and back. And so we shout out everyone before the stroll. For the war pint on the way out, they can complain about Medicaid. On the way back, they talk about all the good things they can do to help each other. And I would point out, I've noticed over the years doing this, typically it's 1 to 2 miles max for families experiencing disability is a really good length. And what we do is we set it up at 10 o'clock for arrival, but we don't go on the hike till 10:30, and we offer coffee and cookies for the first 30 minutes. And really, that's not the purpose of it. It's actually because, like I mentioned earlier, that diaper issue, a wheel fell off someone's wheelchair 2 weeks ago. It's the idea that you can turn up whenever you like and you still feel welcome. You're not turning up late because your child caused something to happen. So that little subtleness is just all the efforts you make to try and make it as welcoming as possible. So with that, I'll just pause, and I'm just curious if folks out there have other ideas of integrated programming that they've tried or have dreamed of trying.
So you can feel free to use the chat or you can unmute yourself.
And I know this one's a bit harder to answer sometimes.
Yeah. I think people are probably processing and thinking. Sophia shared in the chat, dreamed of organized sports.
Oh, that's a great one. I've got a nice slide later of Lydia playing softball. There is leagues out there for children with disabilities. Unfortunately, are segregated, but at least it gets out into that activity.
We have
I'll
Sonia
probably-
sharing
okay.
Sonia sharing creative arts.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And there is amazing programs. Lydia has an eye gaze program now where it's sensors tapped to her eyes, and that's tied to a computer so she can paint on the computer using her eye gaze. So there is some wonderful adaptive devices out there now for things like that.
Some other things coming through the chat are cooking classes and inclusive field trips at schools.
Yeah, that is great. All right, I'll just keep moving along and time check. Marissa, how long is left for the talk?
It is 11:05, so we still have like a half an hour plus. We are good.
Oh, perfect, right in the middle.
Yep.
Yeah, it's interesting the programming. Like I mentioned earlier, if I had one wish granted, it would be for out in nature. We said we did a rule where, hey, if there's a pair at school, there needs to be a pair in nature for the family, and things would change overnight for families.
Mhm.
So from combined,
Updated, real quick, sorry, Mark, an updated time check. We have about 40 minutes, 40.
okay,
Yeah,
great.
so we have time.
So this next section then is really I've touched on this, but it's as a I've designed parks and planned parks for I think it's 20 and it might be 30 years because I actually started when I was 16 as a volunteer to build trails. So I've done nothing else around my life. And I did realize at some point I was doing it all wrong, and that was Lydia teaching me. Frankly, it's amazing, especially a nonverbal child. It's interesting when you get to about 5 or 6, and you can spend 30 minutes to have like a what you'd class as like a 2 sentence conversation. But and I mean by that is Lydia, you can use expressions and body movements where you really know what she's about. And then what I mean by this is when I'm outside, and it started to dawn on me the way we've confined play, and frankly, not just for children with disability, all children, we've got to move back to free play. And what it did with this, I mentioned earlier, I was really lucky to work with Louise Charla. And I mean, I think in the second slide, I put her article, which is Hope. And she spent a couple of years really analyzing things like anxiety in children, the need to get out in nature, and like sensory perceptions that are critical that we're losing. And so that's when I was thinking about how I designed in the past, it's on the right where I started. And that would lead to children having activities with emotional responses through sensory inputs. And working with people like Adam and Michelle and Louise, I realized we need to reverse the design process. So it's why don't we start with the senses, then see what emotions and activities occur from those, and then actually design for play and access to nature. And just simply turning it on its head was like a light bulb went off. It completely changed the way we look at design in Boulder now. I've got a team. I'm looking up to have a team of 14 staff who do design, planning, construction, and we're applying this for the first time. And it's a little bit revolutionary for people who've gone to school for like 5 years to learn design to reverse engineer the whole process. But it seems to be working. So here's the idea of the sensory inputs, and I know there's 9 in total now. I am not the expert, I'm just a park guy, but I've learned there's 9, and I'm working with people who know that stuff. And you'll see there, if we start to think about disability access and access to nature, you get overwhelmed so quickly because of the spectrum of disability, all the way from physical to neurodiversity and everything around and in between. Well, actually, if you just threw all that out the window and simply said, how do we work with senses? I'm finding that's a way to really focus in and support it. And what's interesting about that is you don't even then end up with like ADA, American Disabilities Act design, or universal design, the other aspect of the sort of rules that are in place to help children with disability. Instead, you throw all that out the window and you simply start with sensory inputs, and now it's completely inclusive because this could apply to any child, couldn't it? And with Lydia, the sound of birds, like she'll have a seizure if the microwave door closes. Frankly, if Jack farts, she might have a seizure. You shouldn't laugh, but you do laugh because it's kind of ridiculous. But so if there's these sounds that will set off a seizure, there's also sounds that will create intense joy. And just understanding that with a child, you can completely change on its head how you get that access. Uh, the smell, the Ponderosa cookies, if you smell a Ponderosa, you get the cookie smell. Lydia, the vestibular, I mentioned that earlier, bouncing along. So we start now taking these sensory inputs for children with disabilities, and then we look at the emotions wheel. How can we, through the emotions wheel, see what responses we can get? And there's that idea of dignity at risk. They're not all supposed to be safe and calm. They're supposed to be uncomfortable. They're supposed to be fear. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And this is it. I work with the psychiatry group on the East Coast and also Louise, and it's that idea of distress tolerance. and this is really where risky play comes in. We've totally taken out of our children's ability the choices they can make to be uncomfortable. So you'll see they're safe, is exciting, happy, they're doing things. And this was at a local school I was working with, Horizons K-8 school. And you'll see what happens now is children will go straight from green to red, the crying on the bottom right. Instead, we need the orange, determined, brave, balance beam. These are places where kids will get uncomfortable, and that's where the learning occurs. So if I'm putting Lydia on that swing I mentioned earlier, which moves 2 foot and is on, smelling the off-gassing, she's never going to be uncomfortable. All she's going to be is safe. So no, Lydia will not learn a thing. And instead, she'll move straight overwhelmed if there's like a loud clangy noise, whatever. So this was a huge eye-opener for me to understand this from kind of the more scientific side, the expert side. So we've been building in uncomfortable spaces for children again. And then obviously once you've got the idea of the sensory inputs and the emotions, what are those activities? So we've made long, long lists. This is just one page. We've got about 4 pages of every single activity a child can do. And I think it's almost like at this point, there's supposed to be 27, what is it, sets in a play or actions. Well, we're realizing there is a certain set of activities. And then it's simply starting to think about those activities instead of thinking of that prefab playground or that 10-foot concrete trail along, the urban park, or that wilderness trail where you can't get off the trail, you've got to stay on it, so it's kind of boring. This is just simply getting into the activities children can do and how you can adapt those. And then here's an example of a nature play area built now, it's 1 mile long, the trail. And this is a critical piece because if you think of that confined play that we have and the segregated ages, the 3 to 6, 7 to 12, teens, instead, this covers all ranges. It's also, like I mentioned earlier, like a resin-bound trail, so you can bounce along. It's 3 foot wide. And even if Lydia can't get to all of these nature pods, as I've called them, she's able to still experience nature. She's able to get her sensory inputs and still have universal access to as much of the space as possible. But the point is, she's in nature, and frankly, it stops the parents sitting on a bench with their iPhone for half an hour thinking they've got free time. Instead, the parents are involved as well because of the having to walk around the trail. So this has been a big success to move to trails being longer and the nature play pods spaced around them, in this case using animal themes. Actually, my favorite was it's not here, the fantasy animal. They created a cantaloupe because we work with kids on this. And so they'd have an imaginary play area and they wanted a human play area, which I thought was wonderful. So this is where I'll start to sort of close in a little bit. And what we've developed then, and this is working with Adam Bienenstock, is 4 types of play, natural play. There's the gross motor, which I mentioned. We've kind of got that in spades, physical and exert. But now we're developing the fine motor, loose parts, sand and water drawing. We're creative and collaborative, the outdoor classroom, stages, games, quiet and contemplative. And, if you go back to that first exercise, you'll all remember kind of describing these from your childhood, but we don't make these available in parks, state parks, for children anymore. The book collecting, for example, is a fine motor skill. So this is the goal, is that we're trying to make these 4 play areas be common now and aware for parents and give the parents, frankly, confidence to let the children play in them. So there's some of the gross motor skills for being an experiment. Lydia is my petri dish. I must admit, me and her have a bit of fun together and we sometimes hurt ourselves, but most of the time we've survived so far. But there's, taking Lydia sledding, getting her out in, like, you can see on the fountain there in top right in downtown Denver with a wheelchair, getting wet. On the left, out in the wilderness. The fine motor skills, we haven't talked about food much yet, but that is a critical one, isn't it? The gardens are amazing for sensory. On the right, I just had to put in the cute picture of her dog, assistant's dog, Gromit. But on the bottom right, you'll see Gromit, and this is a good example of how you can work with kids with disabilities. Gromit is an assistance dog, but he didn't have the skill when he came to us. He was trained not to bark, for example, to not give us seizures and sit in a lap. But we trained Gromit to lick. Lydia obviously has claw hands, a lot of common thing in kids with disabilities, like with CP, claw legs. So the clawness in a hand, Gromit's been trained to lick the inside of a hand, which relaxes it, and then opens up a hand, which helps her find motor skills. And if you just start to get that creative and adaptive, this is how we truly can create like those parallel universes for kids with disabilities, especially on the far end of the spectrum, like Lydia, to still have that experience that we have. Creative and collaborative, this is the other one, you see in the left there, the families hanging out like the roll and stroll, but the bottom right, the bottom two are an outdoor classroom we just built 6 months ago. And I would point out, moving away from prefab, I've had people tell me that would be 120 to 180,000 to build that nowadays with a consultant and prefab. We built it for 14,000 and it's for the local Crestview school. And I just want to point out at the back next to the chalkboard of the nest on the right that's the little area for 2 wheelchairs. And then at the front in the shadow, you'll see another area for a wheelchair there. And that's, the example I talked about earlier. Some kids want to be center stage, whereas someone like Lydia probably wants to be backstage, especially with the heat and the shade. And then using that on the right, that resin bound surface, where it provides a much more attractive surface for kids and is frankly universal. And then maybe a couple of my favorite pictures of Lydia when she was. But here's a great example of thinking sort of outside the box. Was, if Lydia's in a wheelchair and a lot of kids like this and doesn't have like non-mobile, she can't lift her head up. So that's why she stayed with peripheral vision. When you old folk know this much better than me, but as you can move your head, your eyes go to the center and you lose the peripheral vision. Whereas Lydia, it stayed with her. So all she ever does is see the ground. And I quickly discovered if I lie on her back and she's looking up at the canopy, she can see that dappled light and shade. And it's amazing the smile you can get from her, just the sense of peace. And it dawned on me, like, instead of putting benches along trails, why don't we put these little side spaces with a little mat where you can put a blanket on and you can lift a non-mobile child up and put them on the ground so they do get that sense of the canopy that we all get, which is almost like an innate aspect of human nature. On the bottom right, there's a bit of serendipity there. There's absolutely an example of, it's a 3-layered deck just around 3 trees. It's next to a nature play area. It wasn't designed for this, but you can't see Momi, but Momi's jumping in up and down, playing on it, doing a little bit of gross motor. Jack's just chilling out, being Jack, sort of shouting a bit. I'm trying to get a nap in the chair in the background. But the key thing to notice here is the eye lines between Jack, myself, and Lydia are all on eye line. If you're with a child looking down or you're on your knees looking up, it's really awkward for that interaction. That's why we work on eye lines. So a simple design like this created a space that's very rare for us to have eye lines all together, and it made us all feel really comfortable. And I'm trying to build that in all the designs now, even though that was an accidental find. So just to finish up then, I've got just a few slides left that I'll whiz through. But I know at this point, because I myself get overwhelmed by the spectrum of the disability world and how would you accommodate all that into programming and design? So I've realized there is maybe some simple steps. And like I mentioned earlier, those sensory inputs being a starting point, work on that, and then build out from that to make it, all community thing. I won't talk through this list because it's really long. My wife was like, you need to reduce that slide, Mark. But there's good bits of information in there. And the one thing I'll point out is the second bullet, letterboards, for kids learning. Like Lydia's got a computer now, but you can start off on a simple letterboard for phrases, words, symbols. Even if your child doesn't use a letterboard but experiences disability, as a parent seeing that as at the entrance to a trailhead or a park, you'll immediately think, these people support me or they know me a bit. And little things like that sense of welcoming is so key. And I showed you a picture of Sarah at the beginning, Sarah being able to welcome people in who experience disability, who experiences disability herself, to a public meeting and offer a sensory room. It's the welcoming, that 30 minutes for the coffee and cookies so people can come late and not feel overwhelmed. These are the welcoming is kind of the key, I think, at this point. And then this is my back in Oregon days, I was working on the John Day River. It was like a 20,000 acre park, about 12 miles of the John Day. And I created something called the Wild Ometer, and it was for old youth. How do we get youth from backyard to backcountry And how do they build confidence to get outdoors? Because this was Richard Lew's Last Child in the Woods. So I decided to adapt that for Lydia. And this is Lydia's wildometer. I think you've got to be British to say wildometer, because I think in America you'd be like wildometer or something. My British background helps with that pronunciation. But you'll see there, it's urban, local parks, nature, wilderness. And we work with Lydia. I've got a bunch of these, and I try to change them up every now and again. But here's just some simple examples. Here's urban, and I'm sure you've probably seen a couple of these images, but it doesn't take much to get Lydia into nature. But like I want to keep saying this, there is a lack of confidence in parents to do this. I was just lucky that I've worked in parks all my life, that I had the sense of it. But I know most parents would even struggle just to push their kids into this urban environment, especially because of that fragile medical label of fragility for disability children. And that's why I really want to push this idea of the dignity of risk. And there's parks, back to food, but someone mentioned it earlier. There's Lydia doing a softball, and that's Jack pushing her when he was a bit younger. And just a member of the community created a device that swung back that could hold the bat. So when Lydia lets go of it, the bat swings and boots the ball. So there's really simple ways to get the inclusiveness going. Here's the sense of nature getting out there. And I mentioned earlier that the mobility devices out there now are the key. And if parks and schools could start buying these devices and making them available to parents, it would overnight change the way kids can play. Like Lydia at her school now can go outside and play as much as she likes, because she's not just confined to that wheelchair that's simply for concrete paths. And then wilderness. And this is my favorite part. Lydia is the best skier in our family. She goes the most, and that's because there's amazing groups, nonprofits now. You'll see the top right takes two people, but I can get Lydia anywhere into the backcountry now with the devices. And in there, I've got, and then you'll see in the middle, I do have a 1985 VW Westie that we go camping with. But in there, we've got Lydia's pocket oxygen machine, a G-tube, you name it, EpiPen. And it's what we've done is we've learned that we can't really go on our own, but they're our good friends. You'll see in the pictures on either side of the van, if two families get together, you can pretty much make anything happen. And there you see on the top left a garden cart, which we took 3 miles out into the backcountry, and that was Lydia's device to get her out. So it doesn't even have to be a fancy, expensive people equipment. It's just kind of the will sometimes to get it done. And the bottom right is where Lydia does have a nurse now. We're lucky enough with Medicaid for now to have a nurse support Lydia a couple of days a week. But that's that idea, that para being there, because, as a parent, you can't do this stuff all the time. And Lydia's 60 pounds, and it takes 2 people to transfer her now, So that's kind of it. It's this idea of fostering kinship in nature, sense of belonging, building relationships, integrated, and hopefully the sensory environments tied to emotions and activities will be sort of a way forward to think about design and programming for kids with disabilities. So I'll sort of just end on that thought with the wildometer in mind. How can you see children with disabilities being integrated into parks, play areas, and nature? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for the wonderful presentation. Thinking about this last slide and this question, or I guess it's kind of like a reflection for us to think about moving forward, but kind of opening up for discussion for anyone to either use the chat or unmute yourself. So with the wildometer in mind, how can you see children with disabilities integrated into parks, play area, nature, the wild?
Mark, thank you for this presentation. It was really insightful and very, very cool. And just thinking about children with disabilities and kind of how you mentioned the spectrum of disability and how it can be so, in a sense, overwhelming. And then, along with the more severe cases with medical fragility and the parents feeling the need to protect, I thought it was a really great topic to get into about the risk factor and just how staying comfortable doesn't promote learning. I think that's my biggest takeaway from this. And that, a little bit of discomfort can lead to really big gains. So I think it's something I'm going to think about trying in my future with kids with disabilities. Thank you so much.
I appreciate that. It's funny, I mentioned the Anchor Center for the Blind in Denver, where she went for preschool, and they would grab all the kids and they'd get leaves dropped off in the little play area, about 4 foot high, and all the kids would be buried in leaves. But the point was that no matter what spectrum they were on, they all had that amazing sensory experience together. And even though we're nonverbal, you'd see them smiling at each other. And frankly, at first going into it, of course, you feel uncomfortable if anyone's burying you. But it's that sense of creating it and then just giving it a few minutes to like settle down and then see that it can actually be fun. So I love that simple tool that they used, material as well, and just the thought process that went into it.
Yeah, and again, to talk on that, the simplicity of all of this, it can be done with like literally zero equipment. And that's kind of the main idea, is that it's already embedded in nature as all these wonderful, ways to be creative and and the sensory input. And I just love the inclusivity of like attacking each sense. Everybody can engage in some sort of way. Maybe if they're not able to use all five senses, they're able to, use most of them, which is just really neat.
I appreciate that, and that's that in parks parks are always associated with schools. We work with schools all the time, and I would that swing I showed you, for example, is about $40,000. Imagine if we could buy 10 Axums for $16,000 that wheelchair Lydia has, and have parents swing the kids around in those and run them around. It would be you'd have 16 kids able to do something at once, and it would be half the price. And that's what I've realized is this doesn't have to be expensive.
Erica, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah. Mark, I just want to say thank you for being so open and honest with us about your family story. That's really powerful to hear. And then I also just want to think about the question too of the generational impact of youth being around each other, right? So like if you are a kid who has, all the functions of your body, but you're around children who may not, I'm just thinking about future parents and just like that modeling of, right, like it could be you who has a kid or somebody or love who has a kid like that. And that's something I'm really noticing when getting out into parks and spaces is the kids learning about all the different types of families. And so I think that that's the part where I think about integration, is that just the general community understanding of all the different things that could happen to a family and how we support each other. And so I just appreciate that element too, of you all being out on your walk together on that morning, and all the families getting to see you, and especially the kids, because we used to hide we still do a lot, hide everybody away. And
Yeah.
so that part too, I'm just starting to think, I got 4 babies of my own,
Hmm.
and then thinking about, right, like what are their families going to look like, right? And what are we going to do to support their families in the future? And so
No, I
just
appreciate
think
that.
that's important.
And if you don't mind me saying that I really do appreciate that, because my wife works 2 days a week for a nonprofit, Peak, which basically supports children with disabilities getting access to school, which is becoming harder and harder nowadays, sadly. And she works with a lady who was in an institution because she was classified as having a disability, and to get out of the institution, she was sterilized. And there's still 32 states where it's legal to sterilize females with disability. And it's interesting because then if you think about, after the institution, there was a fight then to get kids into school because they weren't in institutions with disabilities. And that succeeded, got into schools. And then there was the ADA law to get ramps and signs. But maybe there was such stigma, families still weren't going out. And I've noticed this, my wife, especially with her network, the mothers all talk about, it's only in the last 5 to 10 years that they've realized they can go outside with their children and not be stigmatized or stuff it. I don't care about the stigmatization. And unfortunately, as they've gone out, they're like, oh, nothing's accessible, or everything's been made so safe, it's really boring. And so what I love about what you're talking about as well is that with that, like I noticed with Jack and Momi, and Lydia, they're all supposed to be in separate parts of the playground, the 0 to 6, the 7 to 12, the teen. And so we've actually made the playground segregated so the ages can't interact, which is how the learning occurs, isn't it? The mentorship. And, speaking of intergeneration, we also have the grandparents live with us now. And, I wish there was more ways we could have grandparents living with families, because for us, it's massive the way the children learn from the grandparents as well. So there's lots of thoughts on that intergenerational, isn't it, to sort of overcome.
Yep. Thank you.
Mm.
I just want to say I appreciate like your creativity for kind of helping, kids access the community. I'm an early interventionist and I often go to community outings with families, and I find like it's so frustrating when there isn't super accessible parks or things, because I work with really little ones under 3 years old. But this made me think about how I can be a little bit more creative and help the families to find different ways to access different areas, even if it's not your typical inclusive setting. Like, how can we, kind of adapt it ourselves? So I want to say thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
I also wanted to appreciate, your presentation. It was great. It made me think about my family's experience. We have a niece, who I remember she's 2 years younger than me, but I remember that growing up with her, we always embrace her and we always love her, and she's our baby and she will always be our baby. But I remember stories about how the doctors used to say, oh, she's not gonna make it. She's not gonna live through her adolescence. And now she's 42.
Mm.
And I feel that it was all, the community, it was our family, but our friends and everybody. We all had a part on that. But yeah, thank you. I appreciate you.
No, I appreciate that, and I agree that the biggest thing my wife and I talk about is that unfortunately the medical profession still uses this medically fragile concept, and the way they talk to you is, wrap your child in cotton wool and never take them outside, and they're going to die. It's kind of bizarre to think about that. That's the common language in the medical profession, and it's not one off. It's every single parent in the Facebook groups, CP warriors, disability moms, disability dads with children with disabilities, sorry, we all say, why do they tell us this? Why do they put the fear of God into us? And it takes you about 6 years to get over that fear. To be honest, I've noticed it's around about when your kid's 6 or 7, you're like, oh, stuff it. I don't care if they fall off the couch onto the floor because you didn't prop them up correctly. Like my other 2 kids do the same thing. They fall down the stairs. So it's interesting. I wish the medical profession could sometimes see this type of thing and learn from the parents, frankly, in this world. It's one of the biggest barriers, is that sense of mentally you immediately think you've got to protect your child at all costs and not expose them to the outside world. Sorry, I got a bit passionate there.
Mark, this is the group to be passionate. So thank you. I'm seeing just some things come in through the chat. So some other people might have comments where they want to unmute, but I just want to make sure we address. Misha shared, thank you for mentioning the sound of birds. I do birding with children and have been thinking about ways to create more inclusive experiences.
There's a wonderful educator here in Boulder, David Sutherland. You should get in touch with him. And he actually recognized how classical music comes from bird sound. And he actually got invited to DC to the classical orchestra there, and he played the bird sounds, and then they played the orchestral pieces tied to the composers who were inspired by bird sound. And it's amazing. Like Lydia, I didn't point this out, but Lydia actually, it's almost like she's got bionic hearing, because 70% of her seizures are noise, and it'll like the clang of the microwave, like I mentioned, Jack farting, or these weird noises. Whereas on the spectrum of like a guitar or a bell, I can get the most incredible smiles. And then I got a bit lazy, so I tried to do that noise on my phone and she stopped smiling. And I realized it's the vibration of the sound is what makes us smile. It's not you just can't repeat that on a phone. It's the true sound. And that's when I started to get around into nature. So there's an interesting combo of music and bird sounds that are amazing for kids experiencing disability that's a few people are exploring. And yeah, I'll happily provide Dave Sutherland's contact info because his programs are fantastic for kids with disabilities.
Thanks. There was another comment that came through the chat saying, I love the challenge, the common ADA accommodations we see in our society and how they are not really providing access to the sensory experiences of being in nature.
In fact, they prevent them, sadly, at the moment. And it's no, like, I don't blame ADA because ADA is fantastic. It got, in the 70s, it got people out of cars, up ramps, into cafes, into medical places or into shops, but it was never designed for beyond like an urban center. And that's, I think what I've been trying to describe today is we need a whole new approach to parks, nature, outdoors that goes even beyond universal design, which is even that's supposed to be the more encompassing, but it still doesn't function well enough yet.
There's another comment that says the idea of having paras like we have lifeguards is awesome. How simple yet profoundly impactful that would be. I'm thinking about how we could take action to get the ball rolling on this idea.
Please. You know what grants so I always joke, my wife and I as well, is it IEP or EIP? I should know now, but I always get them mixed up. It's IEP. Thank you. I'm bad with letters and words. It would be wonderful almost if every kid had an IEP, we say, because I'd love it for Jack and Momi if they had one as well. It's the most, when it's done right, it's a wonderful document. So paras and IEPs would be like great things to implement for getting kids outdoors.
Thomas, go ahead.
I really liked how you talked about the balance between programming and integration. I was really enlightened by that. And I was just wondering what would be like an example of like too much integration? Because like in like my classroom, right, I always want to thinking of ideas to integrate into general ed or integrate into the rest of the school. And I know the balance is key, but like what would too much integration look like?
That's a great question. I've actually never ever thought of that. Too much integration.
If even that's a thing, honestly, it's kind of like just where my mind's taking it.
Well, think of it. Yeah, Lydia's Lydia, this is her voice. If she, imagine you've had like your 10th seizure in an hour. Because we took out the corpus callosum, it actually created more space between her seizures for cognizance. So it went from 5-10 minutes to 20 to sometimes even an hour. But when that cognizant period, it's very easier after that seizure or even building up to it for her to get overstimulated, and it's too much for her. So you've got to sort of take her out. So your point there is, yeah, I go back to another example is Sarah, who I mentioned, who's our disability community connector. Hey, I need this sensory space. And she has a bear friend that's her like assistance bear, and she can go into that space and take time out. So I would say it's more, we keep trying for the integrated, but how do we find those little off ramps that are needed to accommodate? It's the accommodations is what I'm trying to say for those situations. And often there isn't accommodations, and then the parents will just leave, after 10 minutes. And that's, again, going back to the rolling strolls, we always stop every 10 minutes because we always get strung out and everyone catches up. And we've noticed that the parents with kids who are like new to this world, they'll give up pretty quick. And so we've got to, it's sort of never leave anyone behind. But it's definitely trying to just create little spaces to build confidence and to provide an off-ramp, I think. I'm not sure if that's a great answer, but
No, that was perfect. That was perfect. Thank you.
In the chat, I'm seeing another comment, a couple coming through just about thank you for the presentation. But one just came through. It says, hi, everyone. Last year, as a special education para, I accompanied special children to the disabled student sports meeting for the first time. I could feel the children's joy. They felt valued and loved when they participated in the event. I am currently helping a girl to stand up. She's also trying hard. At first, she needed both of my hands to support her, but now she only needs one hand. Every time she makes progress, I am so touched. I very much look forward to her standing up one day. All this is inseparable from the special education team, including the cooperation of special education teachers, PT, and para.
That's beautiful. Do you mind if I bring one thing up there as well?
Yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I myself use words that were derogatory towards the disability community prior to Lydia being born because I was ignorant of the person first language. Are you folks all aware of person first language? And it's,
Yes,
you
I
can
would say
look
most
up,
of us are. Mhm.
and it's interesting, isn't it? Because we still use special or special needs. And it's really frustrating for parents that we're stuck with that language. Why would a child be called special? You know, Lydia's not special, but her Jack and Momi are special, but she's not special in herself compared to Jack or Lydia. And it's interesting. I do get folks know Kathy Snow. She yeah, she's been a hero of ours because she sort of led that movement for person first language and been lucky enough to put some trainings on here in City of Boulder. Because one of the other barriers we see all the time is the lack of use of first person language. And I'm not saying it's happening here, but just even that term special needs is so outdated, isn't it? And I know we're stuck with it because federal law requires you to call it special needs to get the funding. But it would be wonderful if we could start to move away from that at some point. And I know that's tough, though. I know how hard that is. But even like at work now, folks won't use the word "I'm so dumb" because that would mean you nonverbal. And Lydia's nonverbal, so you're pointing out that my daughter's kind of stupid. And I love the fact that people are, once they see first person language, they just build in their lexicon a whole new way of, and it also, I've noticed, helps people almost think of kids with disabilities different. They're not sort of seen as, hey, that one kid got the basketball shot in the wheelchair. Let's have that on the 6 o'clock news. Like it treats it somehow as being extraordinary when it's not. It shouldn't. It's just everyday life. So that's one of the things a bunch of the families I work with or like network with. We often talk about that. Like, how do we get person first language to be commonplace?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. I know in some of our classes we talk about person first, and there's a little bit of individualized, I guess, pushback on that, more about like disability first language and some
Yeah,
groups of individuals like those, with autism, like
right.
being identified as an autistic individual versus a person with autism. So there is like kind of that spectrum, right?
True.
I
Yeah.
think so oftentimes what we try to encourage is just like sort of asking the family or asking the child if they are verbal, what they prefer and how to
Mm.
be addressed or discussed. But separate from that is sort of like the special needs and not using that language.
No, I do. And I know you folk are working hard on that. I meant, more in general society, we talk about it like,
Yeah.
oh, in other aspects of equity, that would never be tolerated. How come it's tolerated in the disability community? It's just an interesting one, isn't it? It's a complicated one.
Mhm. And oftentimes it might be just because individuals don't have a voice. So
Yeah.
it's their family members or the ones who are working with them who need to voice those things for them.
It's true. It's true.
Seeing a comment coming in from a chat, I think from this discussion, I think there's a lack of awareness when it comes to the use of language towards people with disabilities. I think it needs to be pushed more. Of course, that starts with us correcting and educating people who use that language, etc.
Appreciate that.
Are there any other like questions or comments? Anything else? Is there anything you didn't anticipate? Or what did you anticipate learning from today? Or didn't? we're
I just put
surprised.
the thank you slide in there to you all, by the way, because I appreciate being invited today.
Thank you. We're so glad you were able to join us. Okay, well, I think that probably is nearing the official end of Mark's keynote and discussion. So I know Mark, Misha, who was asking about the birding and the bird sounds earlier, was wondering if you could put the name of, I don't know if it was Dave Sutherland or someone else you had mentioned.
Yeah, if you just type in Dave Sutherland Boulder, he's got about 3,000 following, so you'll find him quick. But if not, you can email me and I'll happily put you in touch.
Okay, wonderful. And I think, Mark, I have a draft of your slides, which might be the actual final, but if you could just make sure you email me a copy so I can share it out with everyone.
Oh, for sure. Happy to. And yeah, no, seriously, thank you for listening today. I feel like I'm just a dad with had a little bit of a life story with my daughter, and with Lydia being nonverbal, it's lovely to help give her a voice and people willing to listen to it. Actually, it means a lot to the family for that to happen. So it is a lot of deep gratitude for letting me talk today.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate you joining us and just sharing your story. I think I think Erica had mentioned it earlier, just appreciate your vulnerability and sharing what the journey for parenthood was and sibling relationships and just everything else that your family went through. I'm seeing one more hand come up last minute, so I want to see Laura. Did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I know you said that you wrote an article that they put into 2 parts. You mentioned something about you had to write something and I was wondering if that was something we could access to. I think you, did I misunderstand? I thought you said that you wrote 40 pages and then they split it into 2 parts. And I just wondered if that was something, it would be interesting for me to read. Think if that's available. Thank you.
Yes. Can you see that? Is that popping up?
I'm just checking. Yes.
So
If you're looking at the screen, not the meeting, you can see it. So I can try to download those and share those out.
and I would mention, like, I think you folks might know Louise Charler, I'm not sure, but she's just fantastic resource and so helpful on this, youth access in the outdoors. And then Adam and Michelle do amazing work with schools and parks to get kids out into nature and do a bunch of the universal access work. So I just feel very lucky to work with those folks.
Great, thanks. And I'll make sure to download these and send these out or like link them in the chat so people can have them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And actually the conference for that, the Children Nature Network, is in Minnesota this year at St. Paul's in May, and it's the Nature Everywhere conference. And I've found that to be the best conference to talk about getting kids outdoors, as well as, this growing movement for universal access. It's been a wonderful conference.
Great. Okay, Mark. Well, thank you so much for joining us and spending your morning / early afternoon with us. And appreciate everything that you had to share. And so we look forward to hopefully hearing from you again in the future.
Oh, thank you so much. And I really appreciate it. Lydia and I.
Tell the family hello.
I will. Take care now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, everyone. So we are nearing the end of our conference. Really just appreciate each and every one of you joining us here today. We had about 78 people and maybe a couple more RSVP to this event. And it looks like we had about 75 because we have 3 screens of 25. About 75 people here, which means that we were able to get the word out. Earlier this week, I was sharing with Melissa, we had 50 something. And so there was a big burst of additional people who are RSVPing, either people who had forgotten, didn't realize that they had access, or that means that we were able to spread the word and we had more community partners and people across the state joining us. So if that is you, we are grateful that you are here to learn and listen with us today and reflect. A couple of or I guess a quick housekeeping thing. As I mentioned earlier, if you were a facilitator, if you want to send me the recording early next week, once you have it from Zoom, then we will make sure that we link and add all of that to Canvas as well as to the agenda. And so once everything is like downloaded, viewable, we will make sure to email everyone for that information so you have access to it later on. Again, if you're an SF State student, you can access things on Canvas. We do have to manually add each of you. So if you are an SF State student and you do not have access to Canvas, if you just want to let me know, you can email me. I just added my email to the chat. So, because that will, I mean, we're not going to do anything with the Google Doc. The agenda will also be there, but I know sometimes like finding it and locating it can be tricky within your email. So you'll have access to Canvas if you're an SF State student, and then everyone who's here will have access to the agenda, which will have the slide decks, and we'll add the recordings on there as well. Another thing that we do in appreciation for all of our presenters, whether at workshop or Mark with the keynote, is we create kudo boards or kudos boards, which are like thank you, like virtual thank you notes. So I'm going to create those and I will send those out on Monday. So everyone can kind of add their note in, and we'll give you a couple weeks to do that. And then they will automatically send to our presenters just as a thank you. So you can share a reflection that you have or a takeaway, or just write some kind words and thank you for them spending their Saturday morning with us. So we will get that out to you soon, early next week. And then in terms of other housekeeping, Melissa or Mina, Isauro, Erica, is there anything else that I am missing?
Hi, no, I already sent you the link to the cloud recording, so you should have access to it and also some notes. So I think that, let me know if that works or doesn't work, okay?
Okay, great, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It was a wonderful presentation. The keynote was amazing, very inspiring. So thank you so much for working so hard on this conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, no logistics things that I need to share. If you're in my 738, you can use this conference as one of your field-based assignments. The first one is due March 11th, but I've already emailed you all about that. So, and I also already sent you the recording for Scarlett's presentation.
Great, thank you.
Yep, for ECE, we really appreciated having this 3 workshop sessions rather than more. So we have a lot more participants, which make our conversation and an interaction really, really like active. So I really like that idea. Also, like how much that we have amazing guest speakers, which kind of like really inspire a lot of early child educators who like to kind of like bring the nature and inquiry into the classroom and curriculum. So I really, really enjoyed it. This year's conference. So thank you so much, organizer Melissa and Marissa. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Well, appreciate everyone. Again, this event is Dr. Friesen, the department chair for special education, mentioned at the very beginning of this morning, which feels like a long time ago. But this is our 11th annual and was really inspired by our colleague who has since retired, Dr. Summer Shaw. Summer was a professor in the early childhood special education program and was one of my mentors when I first came in to SF State in 2017. And Summer and Amber together kind of began this conference, and it's grown. At one point, it was on campus in Seven Hills, which is a conference center, and then COVID kind of changed everything to be virtual. But I think in this virtual space, we're able to bring in Mark from Boulder, Colorado, right, to join us. And it just makes it a lot more accessible, which I think is probably one of the key words for today that really has resonated with me, and I think will stick with me as we think about how to continue to be inclusive for all young children, how we can meaningfully partner and collaborate with stakeholders, especially family members, in this work that we're doing. So no matter what your background is or your major, your degree, just hopefully you're able to have a couple of takeaways from today's sessions and really just appreciate each and every one of you being here and being an active listener. And that is kind of it for our conference. So thank you so much for joining. Again, you'll be hearing from us early next week. I'll hang around for a little bit if people have questions or comments. But otherwise, go enjoy your Saturday. Get out and get some fresh air, get some sunshine on your face, and have a lovely weekend. And we'll be in touch next week. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.